Elliot Costello. Let's start with food waste.
One third of everything we produce globally is discarded or wasted. In Australia, what does that mean? That means about 7.6 million tonnes of food is going to waste per year, which is costing us about $36 billion.
Can you give us an example of how you've done this?
We've done a great project with David Jones. We don't sell any form of packaging per se. We develop technology that shows how we can produce natural material, but then software that can reduce petrochemical plastics. Phantm came together to try and take that as a waste stream and convert it into a new polymer, a natural material to replace polypropylene and polyethylene as a drop-in replacement, and in doing so encourage business to adopt natural materials made from nature. That's literally a conversion from.
Elliot Costello,
co-founder and CEO of Phantm.
He's the son of World Vision CEO Tim Costello and has followed in his dad's footsteps.
Welcome, Elliot. Great to have you for a chat this morning.
Good morning, and I'm glad daylight savings has ended because it's much better on the body clock.
I would totally agree. Elliot, let's start with food waste. On your website, it says, and quote, "We find the hidden value in your packaging data so that we can meet challenging standards, reduce costs, and improve your environmental footprint." Can you give us an example of how you've done this?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. A great introduction. So we did, as a group of co-founders, come together over COVID. I guess we all had a bit of spare time and we're looking at trying to solve some climatic problems. One of my business partners is part of the Barlow Withers family that own and operate 7-Eleven and Starbucks in Australia. Some of her family members were unwilling to push boundaries and take on challenges around petrochemical plastics and the reduction of food waste. So I've sort of partnered up with her and our other two business partners, Sean Hanley and Simon Taylor, to try and take on this challenge. In terms of food waste, why food waste? It's pretty simple. One third of everything we produce globally is discarded or wasted, simply ending up in landfill. And I think it's fair to say that we're all well aware of some of the sort of food security issues we've got globally, not just here in Australia, but right around the world. And to know that one third of food is lost or discarded, ending up in landfill is quite horrific. In Australia, what does that mean? That means about 7.6 million tonnes of food is going to waste per year, which is costing us about $36 billion. So 7.6 million tonnes. That sounds like a large number. To put it in perspective, something that's quite familiar to most of us in Melbourne is the fact the MCG holds about 2,700 tonnes. So we're talking about 3,000 size the times of the MCG. So if you can imagine filling the MCG right up 3,000 times, that's what we're sending to landfill each year in Australia. So there's one significant sort of problem. Phantm came together to try and take that as a waste stream and convert it into a new polymer, a natural material, to replace polypropylene and polyethylene as a drop-in replacement. And in doing so, encourage business to adopt natural materials made from nature. That's literally a conversion from food waste into a polymer, and replace polypropylene, polyethylene, which of course made from oil and gas. So that was our mission, partnered with the CSIRO, Monash University, and had some great success at Bench in developing this technology. Ian, you asked about how that works. We now work with some of the biggest brands in the country, David Jones, Amazon, Asahi, in two ways. We use advisory services, so chemical engineers, polymer experts, and a smart team of sort of consultants that go in and do some advisory work. But we also use technology. So we've built software on top of what we've built to enable businesses to reduce food waste. Specifically, in examples, Asahi, now it's the largest beer owner and manufacturer in the country. With all their manufacturing sites, we have our team that goes out and identifies optimization to reduce what they're sending to trade waste for many of their breweries. So that's just one example of many that we try and use technology and people to reduce food waste in supply chain.
So, Elliot, what about petrochemical plastics? Exactly what are they, and what has Phantm done to effectively reduce the environmental footprint in that particular space?
So petrochemical plastics are exactly what their name suggests. They're a derivative from the energy industry. So our major fossil fuel industry basically pulls out oil and gas. Obviously, we're well aware of the extraction process around oil and gas because that's what generally powers our home. Thankfully, we're transitioning rapidly towards renewables. But petrochemical plastics are the downstream supply from the energy industry. So there's about a $200 billion investment into the plastics industry. So it's a great way to use discarded or unusable oil and gas. And then there's a significant sort of manufacturing process around converting oil and gas into polymers. Now, ideologically, I've got a lot of issues with petrochemical plastics, but I've also seen the full benefit of plastics too. So we're not completely opposed to plastics. I've had a son in a precarious position at the Royal Children's Hospital, and I'm a pragmatist. You need some forms of plastic for sanitation and food protection and preservation and presenting certain forms of food. So there's a role to play for plastics. What there isn't a role for is the overuse of plastics. We've become accustomed to depending on plastics for everything, and effectively, oil and gas are quite harmful for the human body. So, plastic never breaks down, it only breaks up. So, it breaks up into microplastics and nanoplastics. So, plastic never ever gets fully circular. All it does is to break up into microplastics and nanoplastics, which generally end up in either landfill, the marine environment, or our bodies. And in our bodies, they're a toxic chemical. So plastics are now known to enter the human body at about a credit card per week per human. So we're digesting plastics through our food, the chemicals that breaks down in our waters and other ways. I've got an 8-month-old child that sucks on a lot of things that are around the house. So plastics generally enter the human body. And in doing so, that causes harm. So it's crossed the blood-brain barrier, it's through to the placenta. Unborn children will always have some form of plastics in their system before they're even born, and it's causing different forms of cancer. So at Phantm, what we're trying to do is decouple industry away from this over dependence on plastics. So it's cheap, we're talking $2.80 per kilo, but decouple it away from this over consumption of plastic. And I think it's fair to say, well, we have all ordered something online. This package arrive and it's almost multi-layered. There's 3 layers on top of it, and it's of course done to protect your product, but you're pulling these things apart. You've got the corrugated cardboard, you've got EPS, you've got polypropylene, and then you end up with your little product and you've been sent in this huge box. So we now work with companies to try and move away from harmful plastics that are ending up in either the environment or our bodies.
So bringing this down to simple terms, I'm just thinking when I'm shopping at the supermarket and I've got the option of putting the fruit, say, in a plastic bag or not, is that a simple way of reducing the footprint in this particular area?
It is, yeah. And we are almost cycling backwards when you're talking about supermarkets. So Australia's following UK's standards. Tesco, Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's really pushed hard for this grab and go culture. So designing products that you can walk in, pick up, walk out. So why waste time picking up a paper bag and putting your mushrooms in, or why waste time picking up a plastic bag and putting your lettuce in? These products are now designed so you can walk in, pick it up, it's already in 2 forms of plastics, and you walk out the door. Great for convenience, horrible for the environment. So small basic things like bananas, avocados, if you ever see it wrapped in plastic, you should be telling the Soup Coles or Woolies that is ridiculous. There's a natural layer on both of those 2 things, and moving away from that dependency. That's a very sort of individual approach, and I think it's helpful if we can use reusable containers, reusable coffee cups, avoiding plastics in supermarkets, repurposing food waste, simple things that I know my grandfather did growing up in Eastern Melbourne that somehow my parents lost because everything got thrown in the bin. And we're trying to at least invest back into home composting systems, green waste bins, and other forms, because the impact on the environment is horrific when food waste ends up in landfill. So there are a number of ways that individuals can play their role, but we look at this from an industry perspective. This is the overconsumption of plastics is a design problem. And so we sort of go back to design principles and say industry needs to change the way it's providing products to consumers and to take away harmful plastics, to minimize packaging, to minimize secondary and tertiary forms of packaging, to make it a lot easier for consumers to not go home with multiple forms of plastics that inevitably go in your recycling bin, but recycling rates of plastic are at 18%. So 82% of things you put in your recycling bin that are plastic will end up in landfill. That's the state of the nation in terms of recycling.
So Elliot, obviously Phantm has worked with many industries. So is there one that stands out where you feel as though you've had a real impact on making or giving advice and in your consultancy, and where they've taken on the changes and it has had a considerable impact in the way that they're going about the production of their item?
Great question. Most recently, two simple examples. David Jones, we've done a great project with David Jones where we identified, so we don't sell any form of packaging per se. We develop technology that shows how we can produce natural material, but then software that can reduce petrochemical plastics. So we worked with David Jones end of last year and identified $1 million of unnecessary packaging in their supply chain. And so now being able to support David Jones to make very simple decisions to cut out harmful materials in their supply chain that not only saves them money, but helps the environment. So that's a tangible benefit for a company like David Jones. Another great example is Mecca. Most hopefully women on this call know what Mecca Cosmetica is, but it's Australia's largest cosmetics brand, a fantastic success story that has stores all across the country, both retail and wholesale. So they had a product that under their Mecca Imagination line that was just using single-use plastic year in, year out. And we're talking about 13 to 15-year-olds buying these beauty products that was sold in the millions per annum. We've supported them in transitioning to a reusable bottle. And that sounds basic, but in terms of use, we're talking about millions of single-use items, polypropylene with multi-laminate sort of materials, with different sort of gadgets, with different materials that is guaranteed to go to landfill. Because when it gets to a MRF, a recycling facility, it effectively, when it's got these different type of materials, it'll be just thrown away, it'll be discarded because there isn't a process to break that apart, or there isn't value, foreseen value in breaking that apart and reusing it. So there's two good examples of both minimizing materials in supply chain, but also saving companies money.
So picking up on David Jones and Mecca, I'd be just interested to hear what the response of management was like when they realized the savings that you were providing for them.
Good question. This is my 6th year running Phantm, and I would love to say that the response is all driven by sustainability. The greatest value we've had in winning customers is when we can prove or at least offer cost reduction. So initially, a lot of our communication and messaging and marketing was around sustainability, climate technology, reducing food waste, reducing petrochemical plastics, introducing materials that are known to nature and can be integrated with nature if they're fugitive forms, if they find their way to the environment. That didn't sell. What sells really is the fact that you can show that their packaging cost is X, but we can move it to Y through both smart humans and technology. And that's been our point of sale. And that's how we're now working with major brands, because we can identify cost savings and then be able to help them transition to a better materials economy.
Okay. So I'm just thinking of people who are listening in on this today, and in terms of their small corner of the planet and the impact that they could have. So in terms of looking after our environment and sustainability, and we've touched already on this a tiny bit, what are some of the very simple ways that we can actually do this at home?
So there's 3 parts to this story. There's government's role with good regulation. There's industry's role with designing better solutions. And there's consumers who have a force to make decisions of what to do with materials in your hand. So, right now, sadly, the Albanese government failed to introduce an EPR. It was discussed and proposed, and Tanya said it would be done in her first term, but an EPR wasn't introduced. What is an EPR? It's extended producer responsibility. Basically, polluter pays. Right now, the externalized cost for any form of material is the environment or society. So uh, I can start a company today, I can go design a new phone and I can send it to a consumer. All the packaging and the materials of that is externalized to the consumer. So the brand, me as a new company, as a mobile phone operator, doesn't have to worry about the end of life. I don't care what you do as a consumer. You can throw it in the ocean for all I care. You can throw it in the bin. You can plant it in your backyard. You can throw it over your neighbor's fence. What an EPR does is make the company responsible from cradle to grave. And these are known things, like 24 out of the 27 European states have EPR systems. Australia has discussed for years introducing an EPR, so a polluter pays, being responsible from cradle to grave, but Albanese failed to legislate. We're hopeful in a second term of a Labor government or maybe a first term of a Liberal government, an EPR will get passed. That will put regulatory pressure on companies, whether you're selling cosmetics, whether you're selling food, whether you're selling home goods, to be responsible for all of the materials you're placing on market. So that's one thing that consumers can do, put pressure on their local MPs to say, this stuff matters. I'm sick of filling up my recycling bin when I know this is going to landfill. Your glass, aluminium, and corrugated sort of cardboards have a higher recycling rates, anywhere from 40 to 70%, but your plastics are sub 20. So pressure around regulatory is important. As consumers, we also have a voice and putting pressure on companies. If you're a loyal buyer of a muesli company or a yogurt company or a home electronics company, actually telling these brand owners or managers, this isn't good enough. I'm sick of being sent materials that I have to unpack, unravel, and then throw in the bin because it's single use. Brands do listen, and they're hypersensitive to customers. So pushing brands to do better does help. But then on a personal level, as we discussed before, Ian, it's just quite simple to go back to the basics around food waste shouldn't be in the bin. The worst thing we can do as a consumer, because we all have food waste, is to put it in the bin, because that creates methane as it's transported and sent to landfill. And landfill around the nation are filling up very quickly. New South Wales is about to run out of landfill space entirely. So taking food waste out is a primary sort of focus, but then being smart with our materials, separating waste, making sure batteries aren't going in the landfill, making sure we're recycling the right materials, etc., etc. So I don't try and put pressure on consumers, because I think the government and industry has a larger role to play. But as consumers, we can push that pressure up to industry and government.
So it sounds like, to some degree, and I'm probably being a little bit hopeful and encouraging here, but do you think the likes of Phantm have actually put pressure on the government to consider legislating this EPR going forward at some stage?
So we're a private company. We don't do a lot of large advocacy. We work in tandem with groups that do. So we've got great relationships with WWF, Greenpeace, Boomerang Alliance. I've spent 10 years working in the not-for-profit sector, and I see the role for not-for-profits being a lot more objective and independent to place pressure on governments. An EPR would benefit us as a company. So we'll have a role in industry consultation. We'll have a role with our customers to try and push for better standards. But in terms of broad advocacy, that's not our place in the system. We work with Sustainability Victoria. My board chair is a former director at EPA Victoria. So we're involved in the sort of ecosystem without sort of taking a line towards Canberra and saying this is what you need to do. But we acknowledge and support all the not-for-profits and the individuals that are putting pressure on government to introduce an EPR.
So, Elliot, my final question is to you today. What's actually driving you to do this work? What's the backstory for you?
10 years in the humanitarian sector, and loved my work in international development, working across sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Asia Pacific. And at the end of that sort of tenure, I wanted to be involved in the climate movement. There is no separation between the climate movement and the humanitarian sector. The climate movement is a humanitarian crisis, and the greatest form of humanitarian justice is to invest in climate justice. We are facing a climate emergency. Those that haven't accepted it, it's quite sad because it's, even I look at my kids, 3 and 9 months old, 8 months old, they're inheriting a future that's going to be radically different to what I inherited in the 1980s and 1990s as a young child. So we're talking about a minimum 2-degree rise, which will invoke anywhere from 30 to 60 centimeters of seawater rises. So all of our local beaches underwater. I made that decision in 2020 to invest in the climate space. I provided an invitation from my business partner to really look at plastics, and have found, probably ignorant in 2019 to 2020, studying this over COVID. The waste problem is significant. So 400 million tons of waste globally that gets thrown away. 155 million of that is packaging. So we've sort of taken this approach around, energy, the transition's real. I've got solar panels. I'm sure a lot of others on this call do. The cost of energy through renewables is less than traditional forms of oil and gas. So, we're on the right path, even though government's being very slow to invest more and more in energy. We could be an independent energy exporter, but I sort of looked at the energy sector and felt that, that we're moving in the right direction. Plastics, we have a complete addiction to. So my business partners and I saw an opportunity to really, when looking at it, take an approach, as we just mentioned, Ian, not on government, but on industry. How do we support industry in the biggest transition that's required? Decoupling industry away from harmful materials that are coming straight from China. We have no idea what chemicals are in these plastics. There's 13,000 different chemicals used in plastics. Only 6,500 have ever been tested. So every piece of plastic you hold, there's a 50% chance that the chemicals that make up that product have not been tested for human health or conditions for the environment. So it's a 50-50 bet that there's a chemical in that could be harmful to us. And we've all seen the headlines around PFAS, that's now sort of a one banned chemical. So my wonderful partner also works in sort of sustainability, and she is part of a global committee that has to now prove that chemicals are harmful. Instead of us proving that chemicals are not harmful, the petrochemical industry gets to pump these onto market. We now have to go backwards and prove that chemicals are harmful instead of proving they're not harmful. So that's what motivates me, having 2 young kids and knowing that we're sprinting towards a climate emergency, and there's been a blind spot for the plastics crisis that we hold in our hands.
Elliot Costello, CEO and co-founder of Phantm. It's been fascinating to hear your story this morning. Thank you for being a guest here at Monday Matters.
Thanks, Ian.